So for video number 3, we're going to continue going through Python data type, lists, and then we'll move on and actually build our first function. Let's get started. So there's strings, there's numbers, integer, float, and complex. We're not going to worry about complex numbers right now. We're going to talk about integer and float. The difference between integer and a float is 5.0. That's a floating point number, 5.03. Same as 5e to the 3, which is 4,000, right? Those are floats. The number 5 is just an integer. There's lists, tuples, and ranges. We'll talk about these a little bit in a minute. The list is a set of variables of type string or integer. And then there's dictionaries as well for mapping, and then Booleans. So let's go back here to numbers we talked about. Integer and float. Here's an integer. It doesn't have a decimal point. Here's a float. We're not going to worry about complex numbers. We're going to go to strings. Okay, so that's a string. You can print hello. You can set A to that string. We already did that. You can have A equals a multi-line string by using 3 quotes in the end. It can be long with carriage returns in it, or four single quotes. Those are strings, and we'll use some strings later for file names and things like that. Booleans. Booleans can be expressions or a value. So I can say I am 68 equals true. Okay, and so now if I were to ask Python, I am 68, it says it's true. And I said, if I am 68, then I want to say print because I am 68 is true, then it printed, dude, you're old, which I am, I'm old. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Operators are things like addition, adding two numbers together. You can add 2 strings together. You can add 2 lists together. It just goes through the list. There's a whole bunch of things in here. You can go through this at your own pace. I want to go too fast here. I do want to talk about lists. So list is a collection. So I'm going to say L is equal to, and you use a square bracket, A, B, C. So those are, whoops, I got to do that, a comma. They're separated by commas. So I've made a list. I can ask for the length of a list. What's the length of L? That's 3. There's 3 things in the list. I can say L is equal to L plus L. I can add 2 lists together. What's L now? L is ABC, ABC. So what is the length of L? Well, it should be 6 now. I can refer to one element. I can refer to L of 0. So lists start with index 0. So the first element of the list is a 0, and the last element of the list would be a 5. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So L of 0 is the letter A. L of 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 is this B. So that's how you work with lists. You can also set the list to something else. So now if I look at what L is A, B, C, A, and then high and C. Those are just lists. We'll use lists a little bit later. The last thing I want to talk about, tuples are a set of lists. It's like a list, only you use parentheses instead of the square brackets, and you can't change the elements. So if I make a tuple equals, and I'm going to do brackets, and I'm going to put A, B, C, D, C in it, copy, put that in here. Because I use brackets, now this is a tuple. And I can say, what is T of 3? And T of 3 is A, 0, 1, 2, 3. So T of 3 is 0, but I can't change T of 3. It says you can't change a tuple. So we'll use them because they're convenient for coordinates on a map. We're using x comma y, so x, y can be equal to x comma y, which is a nice tuple, and we'll use that. And then you can say x, y of 0 will be the first value, the x value, and xy of 1 will be the second value. In this case, x and y are orange and green. So we'll cover that a little bit later. These are just variables. So in computer language, when you're programming, you store all the information in variables and then you manipulate those variables with operators and with loops and things like that. We'll get into loops here in a second. I want to cover, I'm going to scroll down here and talk about dictionaries. So a dictionary has a string as the index and then an answer. So for example, I can say my dictionary is equal to, and these are separated by curly brackets. So I can say hi is a greeting. I can then say bye is a farewell. Okay, and so now if I say print D, whoops, I forgot my parentheses. It says hi equals greeting and bye equals farewell. So if I say what is D square brackets of bye, and it looks up bye is equal to farewell. So if you think about this as a dictionary, this is the word and this is the meaning, right? You can store things and look them up by complex strings or by or other things to point instead of using just as an index. And we'll use dictionaries in our video game. And then the last thing I want to talk about here is we already did if then else. Let's talk about loops, for loops. So D is a dictionary, okay? If I type D and then I say keys of D, those are the indexes. Those are the words in the dictionary. It's hi and bye. And I can turn that into a list by saying list of D. And so now I've got hi and bye. And I can say for X in this list. So it's going to go through each element of the list, and I'm going to print X. Notice I had to indent it over for that to work. And so it prints the two indices, hi and bye, that are in the list. So you can do that for X equals, I can make this explicit, make it a list. 0, 1, 4, 5, 8, 9. And so it printed X 0, 1, 4, 5, 8, 9. There's also a range function in Python, which is helpful. Instead of this, we can say in range. And range starts at 0. So if I said 10, then I'm going to get, sorry, I have to move my cursor down the end. I get 0 through 9. Sorry, wrong command. Oh, it replaced my keys there. Sorry, I never hit enter. And this is going to be range of 10. So a range starts at 0 and then goes up and stops before it gets to this number. So if I did this explicitly, this is really range of 0 to 10. It's the same thing. If I went 1 to 10, it's actually going to end up with only 9 elements. Right? It goes 1 to 9. It never does the last one. It goes up to it. That's how range function works. So please use this page to look up things anytime you have a question or look into things. But let's go ahead and get started in making our own actual function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make this full screen. And I'm going to bring back the project folder over here where you can see we have our main.py. And we're going to build our function in another Python file. So we're going to right click over here in the menu and say new Python file. And it's going to say, what do you want to call it? And we're going to call it random walk with a camel-backed walk. And it'll automatically take care of the Python on the end. So now we have a random walk.py. So So there we go. This is where we're going to build our function. The first thing we're going to need to do is we need to import random. So that's gives us the ability to generate random numbers, and that's going to be very helpful. So what function are we trying to make? Well, here's a point. This point is in space, so there's an axis around it. There's an x-axis and a y-axis. So this point has a coordinate, x0, y0. It could be anywhere in the space, x0, y0 are the point. And the function we want to build is a function that tells us how to go from x0, y0 to walk in some direction, some angle A, and it could be anything between 0 and 360 degrees, and then go a distance, d, from x0, y0. So we give the function the starting point, x0, y0, and we give the distance we want to go and the angle we want to move at, and we want to calculate the new point, x new, y new, which is xn, yn. So to get from x0, y0 to xn, yn, you have to go a distance delta x horizontally and delta y vertically. So we have an equation that says if you take x0 and you add delta x, shink, and you take y0 and you add delta y, shink, I get to xn, yn. Well, that's great. Now the problem is, how do we calculate delta y and delta x? Well, if you've taken trigonometry, you know that the trigonometry defines that when you have a triangle and there's an angle A in one of the corners of the triangle, if you take the opposite side away from the angle and divide it by the long side, what's called the hypotenuse, so you take delta y and divide it by d, it gives you the sine of A. Sine is a function for a unit circle, and that's the definition of sine. And it's a function we can look up in Python. We can say, give me the sine of 10 degrees. Now, from your trigonometry, if you take the short side or the closest side to the angle, the adjacent side, and the hypotenuse, and take delta x divided by d, that's defined as the cosine function, or cosine of A. So we have these two functions. Given the angle and the distance, we can calculate delta y. So the first thing we do is we multiply both sides of the equation by the same thing, which is d, keeps it equal. So I multiply both sides by d, and that moves the d to the right, because d over d is 1, and d times the sine is this. And you do the same thing for x. And now we have delta y is a function of d, how far we want to go, and the angle. So if we substitute these into the first equation, here is the function we want to build. Given a point x0 and y0 on a tuple in Python, x comma y, we're going to calculate a new point, xn, yn, that's going to take x0 and add d times the cosine of the angle and y0 plus d times the sine of A. Now, before we implement it, let's do a little bit of checking to see what we expect to get. So if I take a random point and I move at an angle of 0, okay, go move to the right, or if the angle is 180 degrees, right, 360 degrees in a circle, 180 is the opposite direction. So if I go either to the right or to the left, what is the difference in the y values? Well, this is a horizontal line going either way, so yn minus y0 is 0. It's horizontal. So the delta y is 0. So that must mean that the sine of 0 equals the sine of 180 equals 0 degrees, because there is no difference for an angle of 0 or 180. There is no difference in the y values. So we get xn, yn is x0 plus d times the cosine of A, and just straight y0, so they're equal. Now in the x case, the distance between xn and x0 is delta x, which in this case is d, or minus d if it's 180 degrees. And you go from here negative, right? And xn would be smaller. So x0 minus xn minus y, xn minus x0 is d or minus d. That means that this dot 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 is therefore this cosine of 0 has to be 1, and the cosine of 180 degrees has to be minus 1. So we'll check that when we get into Python. So this is our new equation for this horizontal line is xn is x0 plus or minus d, and yn equals y0. Now look at the case where we draw a vertical line. So at 90 degrees, we go straight up, or we could go straight down if you do 270 degrees around clockwise, or minus 90 degrees in the counterclockwise direction. Either way, you get a vertical line. And so the difference between yn and y0 is d, either plus or minus d. So the sine of 90 has to be 1, And the sine of 270 or minus 90 has to be minus 1, so go the other direction. And in this case, for x, it's pretty easy, right? The cosine of 90 must equal the same as the cosine of 270, which is the same as cosine of 90. It has to be 0 because there is no change in the x value. It's a vertical line. So we get our equation. So let's go ahead and put these in Python and give it a test. Okay, let's start in the console by checking out our cosine and sine functions. So the first thing we have to do is import math. That's where they're defined. And now we can say cosine of 0. Now the cosine of 0 is when the line is horizontal, angle A is 0, and that turns 1 like we expected. That's great. What about the cosine of 90? That's supposed to be 0. It's not 0. Why is that? Well, it turns out the cosine function doesn't use degrees, it uses radians. And radians are based on pi. So if I say cosine of pi, it's minus 1. So pi is 180 degrees. 2 pi, 2 times pi, is equal to radians of 360 degrees. Oops, bad typo, equals. There we go. So 2 pi is equal to convert 360 degrees into radians. So half a circle is pi. So we need to use radians to convert radians into our angles. So let's start our function up here. So we're going to define a function. It's going to be move d in direction A. And it's going to have the following arguments. We're going to give it a d. We're going to give it an A, an angle, and we're giving it a point to start with. And then we put a double colon at the end to make that the function. And now we have to, let's do this. Let's make this a little bit more explicit. Let's say distance and angle. It's a little easier to read. Now internally, we have to calculate A is equal to radians of angle. All right, we have to convert A to radians. And then we want to create the new x value is going to be equal to, and we're going to keep the results as an integer. So we're going to, this is going to be move an integer number. So we're going to say integer of this current point, the first index of the current point, which is x. Remember, these are tuples, so it's 2 point of 0 and point of 1. So that's the x value plus the distance times the cosine of A. And I think that works. We'll find out. And then the new y value is equal to the integer of point of 1 plus distance times the sine of A. Remember, we converted A into angles. And then what we want to return is a tuple that's got new y, new x, new y. So that's it. Let's, we want to try executing this thing. So let's try, let's go ahead and import math at the top of this function. So this is totally confined. And then what we're going to do is we're going to try, we're going to say print move A and the we're going to give it a distance, let's say 100. We're going to give it an angle, let's say 0. And we're going to give it a point. Let's say we use 200, 200. And we'll go ahead and right click on here and say, right click on here and say run random walk. Name radians is not defined. So let's do math.radians just to make sure that works. And here we're going to do math.cosine just so it doesn't get confused. Math.cosine.sine. Right? Oops. There we go. And now we'll try that. Whoops. Right click, run. Okay, so we said start at 200, 200 and move 100 in direction 0. Well, that means we want to go 100 past that and we get 300, 200. That's working. So what we can do down here is open up the console and we're going to import random walk. And that happened to run our code up there. We'll fix that in a minute. But now we can use our function. So I can say move D in dir A. Let's go distance first. So let's go 300 in 90 degrees. And we're going to start at 0, 0. Move indir A is not defined. Import. Oh, I think I need to do this. From random walk, import everything. Yeah. So we started 0, 0. We moved 300 degrees at 90 degrees. We went straight up. So that function appears to be working great. That's our first function. Next video, we will use this function and actually start placing points in the canvas.